White text over video of past events. Logo, Cultural Access Collaborative. Professional Development Series presents Creating Accessible Cultural Spaces. At left presentation slides, all content will be voiced. At top right, mini video of presenting speaker. Below, an ASL interpreter signs.
Hi, welcome everybody. This session is Creating Accessible Cultural Spaces, a guide to getting started. So it'll be presented by us, the Cultural Access Collaborative. We're so excited you all are here. Next slide, please. Our presenters today are three amazing steering committee members, Josh Garrett, Bill Green, and tooting my own horn, but myself, Karen Tekverk. As we jump in, just note that that if you like this program today, feel free to drop us a donation, and with that, we'll get things started. Next slide, please. I'll start by introducing myself since I'm on mic. I'm Karen Tekverk. You can use she, her pronouns for me. I have two pictures on this slide. One is a picture of me for any folks curious. I'm white, I'm femme, I have brown hair in this picture and in person. On video, I'm wearing glasses. And there's also a photo of some of my work with Shed Aquarium. I'm at a new organization now, the Society for Ecological Restoration. But this photo is of a beam robot, which basically looks like an iPad on a stick that allows folks to have access to our aquarium virtually. And with that, I'll turn things over to our other co-presenters.
Next slide, please. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bill Green. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a white man with dark hair and beard. I'm wearing a blue shirt today and sitting in my office at Lincoln Park Zoo, where I work as the Accessibility and Inclusion Manager. On screen, there's a picture of me with same description, just a lighter blue colored shirt than the blue colored shirt I'm wearing today. There's also a photo of me facilitating a tactile map with Braille of Tanzania with two folks who are also using white canes. One is wearing the logo of the Lions Club. Part of the work I do here is providing facilitated programs for people with disabilities, but I always like to explain the scope of my work as being I'm the only person who does everything from giving tours to working on bathrooms. I get to do a lot with our internal for staff and volunteers, but a lot of external for guests related to accessibility. I will pass it off to Josh.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Josh Garrett, he, him pronouns. I am white bearded male with a black collared shirt and a gray background currently. That is me. In the photos, you'll see a photo of me in a museum, and then a photo of what I call our big mixed family. You'll see yellow hearts around some of the individuals there. You'll see kiddos and there's three photos with me with kiddos with yellow hearts. Those are deaf kiddos there. And then the yellow hearts with the family photo where there's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 or so people lined up there. That's the family. There's 5 yellow hearts representing deaf members of the family, 4 interpreters, and everyone in the photo knows ASL. So today is important to me because obviously it's been a part of my life, my whole life, and I am also a nationally certified interpreter, and that is me. Next slide, please. I will say too, if you want any additional information on the featured presenters, there is a bio that you can click the link on in the chat, which will come up momentarily if it's not currently there. For those of you not familiar with us, the Cultural Access Collab, our mission is to empower Illinois' cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. So there's 4 primary pillars central to our work. And those would include 1, free professional development workshops, hence what you're doing today. 2, an accessible equipment loan program, which you'll hear more about momentarily. 3, an accessible event calendar on our website. And 4, a growing statewide network. Next slide, please. Accessibility is priority for us, and so our program today includes real-time captioning, which is provided by Efficiency Reporting, as well as ASL interpretation provided by Faith Interpreting. If you would like to view captions in a separate browser, you can do so by using the stream text link, which will be included in the chat. We do also encourage you to submit any questions for our presenters using the Q&A feature. So if you have any issues with accessibility, you can also please reach out to our support team via the chat function. In case you find chat pop-ups bothersome for you, you can turn those off with the show chat previews by clicking the caret next to the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Excellent. Let's go ahead and get started.
Hi, this is Bill again. To lay some common ground for our presentation today, I want to talk about what does it mean to have a disability. We're talking about a person is disabled based on their interaction with environmental factors, not based on their body. Not the phrase not based with their body is underlined to emphasize that on this slide. We'll be talking today about 4 different environmental features: the physical environment, communication environment, information environment. For example, Zoom and PowerPoint are information environments we are using today, social and policy environment, and that will include some written and unwritten social and policy environments. The reason we're framing it this way is to pose this as areas that are within your control as people who are part of cultural institutions to remove the burden from people with disabilities. Next slide, please. I'll begin us with the physical environment. Next slide, please. Physical environment includes some of those things that probably come to mind right away in our infrastructure, but also includes our entrances, our exits, our seats, not only what those seats are, but size of those seats, things like that. Bathrooms, where those are located and what's inside them, lighting, oftentimes moving from well-lit to dark places or vice versa can mean a real barrier for some folks. Parking, not only is there enough accessible parking, but what is the distance that you're asking people to travel from those accessible parking spots into your venue? And then any other physical space interacted with your guests. We'll go into a little more depth about those things. Next slide, please. So, physical environment accommodations. On this slide, under that title, it says in parentheses, should not be a burden. And here the reference is a burden not only to folks who identify as disabled, but also to those of us who are working at cultural institutions who are putting these accommodations in place. Accessible entrance, routes, and restrooms. It's great to always have automatic doors in our entrances and things like that. Make sure those are being checked. But beyond that, even letting folks know what are those accessible routes when moving around. When it comes to restrooms, even think about, are you sharing with people places where there are automatic fixtures in bathrooms? And I even think in doors oftentimes with the thresholds when people are coming in and out of spaces, those can be difficult for wheelchairs to cross over. So in thinking about things like that might be in people's routes. Additionally, in this slide, it talks about the availability of wheelchairs to guests. A way to check those out. Family and gender neutral restrooms, including adult changing tables, can be a great support for many people visiting institutions. And then even something as simple as providing a variation in seatings with and without armrests can support different body types. Don't always think of, again, I want to emphasize that we're not making this a burden for our staff. Think of those areas where you maybe have those temporary accessibility things you put up. It might be a temporary ramp going up to a stage that's otherwise static, or even reflective tape on stairs. What are those things that you can think about making permanent so that they're not something that needs to constantly be checked or refreshed or requested? Next slide, please. I also want to think about physical environments when it comes to sensory information. Oftentimes letting folks know those high and low sensory spaces, how those spaces may change on days when it becomes crowded, where are those choke points, and providing that information up front so that people can opt into those spaces rather than find themselves caught in those spaces. Providing quiet areas and provide information before people go. So again, it's about letting them have choice and knowledge ahead of time. Next slide, please. And I'll just leave you with one thing from our physical environment that is kind of a task that I would challenge you with today. And that is to go around your venue and do the simple audit of sight lines. I have an example here at Lincoln Park Zoo where we had some typical post fencing that if you were seated in a wheelchair, your eye line was pretty much looking at a post, like a horizontal post, and it was being blocked looking into those animal habitats. As we've replaced fencing, it's been replaced with a black mesh fence. And to increase even better visibility through the fence, we've added plexiglass windows. So the picture on the left for this slide is that before picture with the post fencing, and the picture on the right is of that plexiglass insert looking into an unobstructed view of our rhino habitat. Any place where you might be asking people to look into things, think about those sightlines for our guests who are seated, and you have that added benefit of also the sightlines for children. So I will pass this over to Josh.
Josh here. Now we'll talk about communications environment. Next slide, please. Within this topic, we'll talk about closed captions, open captions, interpreting, assistive listening devices, and audio description. Next slide. Communications environment etiquette, specifically for those who are deaf and hard of hearing. So when you are working with this population, you would want to speak directly to the visitor and not to the interpreter, which is not always easy to do when you hear the voice of an interpreter. You want to keep hands, hair away from your face, and you don't want to shout or make exaggerated mouth movements for those who would be reading your lips. There are times when it's appropriate to use pen and paper or your phone to communicate with the visitor if they are able to read English, and take turns speaking if there are multiple people speaking. If a deaf or hard of hearing person is speaking, don't pretend that you understand if you don't. And you can also provide email contact information versus phone numbers. So if someone is unable or unwilling to call, having email contact is a great solution for that. Next slide, please. Here is a photo with a captioner blurred out in front, but in the background, you see multiple scenarios of in one venue. The middle screen shows the presenter. The screen on the right shows a presenter with captions overlaid. On the left, you see a presenter and interpreter. And then to the left of that, you see solely a television with captions on it and no presenter. Next slide, please. On this slide, there's 4 photos. On the top left, there is a photo showing captioning on a television above a stage or performance, showing just location that you can place for captions. On the top right, you see an office-like setting with captions at the bottom center of the area being shown. And then bottom left photo is a theatrical performance, and you'll see captions on the upper right of the stage. And then the bottom right photo, you'll see a stage and the captions are on the middle, but on the left side and further back. And so again, there's not necessarily one correct or right way to do placement, but multiple. Next slide, please.
QR code center left.
Here, if you happen to have your phones, you could also do a quick scan of this QR code. It will immediately take you to our captions, but that's also something that you can utilize within your cultural spaces or event spaces. And simply having the QR code generated to a website does the link. People can immediately link to captions and view them from their phones or from a personal device. Next slide, please. Here you'll see both in this photo a captions and a interpreter next to a presenter. And here individuals could choose where to sit based upon if they want to see sightlines of captions and presenter and or interpreter and presenter. Next slide. In this photo, you see a speaker who is speaking in English, which happens to be myself, and a certified deaf interpreter. So I happen to be a certified interpreter, but this is a certified deaf interpreter being utilized for a conference. You have someone who is a native user of the language who can interpret circles around someone like me who I've done it my whole life. I'm nationally certified. Someone who has that cultural background and the linguistic background, they can bring nuances to the language that someone like me will never be able to do. So highlighting that there's great ways to utilize certified deaf interpreters in your spaces. Next slide, please. You can also do remote interpreting, which you see in the top left photo. So you'll see an interpreter in that photo, and you'll see a person who is utilizing those services holding an iPad. In the top right photo, this is in a museum, actually in Rome, and there's an interpreter who is interpreting for a spoken portion and then captions down below. So they're getting audio, they're getting interpretation and captioning, and it's a recorded piece. So it was an entrance to the museum with museum info being given all at once for anyone who comes in at any point. Down below for recorded pieces. So if you have videos and you want to have them captioned, you can caption them. There's multiple ways. One will be where you overlay your captions on top of the actual video, which you'll see in the left photo, where it's just embedded on top of the actual video. On the right photo, you'll see the full screen of video, but below the video, there's a black portion with white words on it. And essentially the two versions are full screen video with captions down below, not at all covering the video. And then the other one on the left there is where the captions cover a portion of the video. Next slide, please. Assistive listening devices, or ALDs, are systems that amplify sounds, especially in noisy situations or larger spaces. So they can improve the listening experience by reducing background noise, and they can be used with hearing aids or cochlear implants. So there's two basic systems that can be utilized within where it's built into an environment, and or these where you can bring this into the environment. These will also be a part of our lending library brought up later. Next slide, please. Audio description is a narration of visual elements in a TV program, movie, show, performance, or a presentation. So description is inserted into these pauses in the program's dialogue to provide context, clarify speakers, and reveal information for the benefit of people who are blind or have low vision. So AD can also benefit those with certain cognitive disabilities. Next slide, please. As far as where to begin, you can find a reputable agency or individual for interpreting, captioning, and AD, and then you can rely on them as experts to educate you in the best practices and setup, so you don't have to go in as the expert, you can utilize them. You can allow those attending your spaces to share what they need or what their preferences are. You can also plan for access in your planning and annual budgets. And then we say start small and then grow it. So something is better than nothing. And that can mean if you have a series of shows, captioning and or interpreting one show, or adding some of these communication access pieces to one show, or doing one a month or one a year or one every 6 months. So just get it started. So build it and they will come. Next slide, please.
Hi, Karen here. I'll be talking about the information environment. So how are your patrons getting information about your program, your organization, et cetera? And I have laid out these next slides roughly in the timeline of the experience of a user. So where are they going to go to first for information? And then what are going to be their next steps? And finally, what happens when they're on site and during follow-up with guests, users, et cetera. So if you are a patron, next slide, please. The first place your patrons are likely to check out is the website of your organization, your theater, whatever. So there are some really basic, important things that you can do to make sure that your website is, first off, just accessible for people. One is making sure that your images are necessary and have alt text. So just as a quick example, we did a bunch of work developing these slides to make sure that our images were needed, and pulled a bunch out, because if you have a lot of images, it can be confusing for folks using screen readers, for example. which is my next point. You'll want to make sure that text can be read by a screen reader. So really basic things are like making sure that you have actual text on your website instead of pictures of text. Sometimes people will grab, a screenshot of a PDF or of a sign, and that is not really best practice. And you at least want to give something like that alt text if you have to do it. You also want to make sure that your site is using clear fonts and high contrast colors. There are some really great accessibility checkers online that you can use for this. So you don't have to know these things. You can just go put your colors and your font size in and see if those contrasts are going to be clear for a lot of folks. And then you also want to make sure that your website ideally is providing planning resources for people so that they can find out, what accommodations are available, what might they want to consider when they're visiting, and ideally maybe even have some social narratives. Next slide, please. Oh my gosh, my go-to accessibility checker. That's a great question. I'm going to go find a link for some if there aren't any in the resources that Carly will be talking about later. All right, so a patron's coming to your space and they're looking to find out about accommodations, and so you're working with them on setting up accommodations. What are important things to consider? First of all, you want to ask early if you're working with a group, if you're working with another organization, because it can take weeks to book a service provider like an interpreter, a cart captioner, etc. Places are really great about trying to help you out a lot of the time, but you want to make sure that you have that notice as early as you can. You also want to share with guests and patrons what's automatically available. If you already have a quiet space, if you have adaptive tools, if you've got the resources for audio description or assisted listening devices on site, let folks know that. Put it on your website, share it in your accessibility materials, so that people can figure out, oh, maybe they already have what I need. This next bullet, how can you get to yes, is something I also always like to emphasize, especially when you're first thinking about how to make things more accessible, because sometimes accommodations can be unexpected, or they can take a little troubleshooting. So 2 quick examples. One, like foldable stools are something that are super cheap and work for a lot of people. Not everyone, hence the troubleshooting, but it's something you might consider in a space that requires a lot of standing, for example. And an unexpected one, I used to do behind the scenes tours at Shed Aquarium. And one of the things that we used as an access tool was essentially a large plastic mirror mounted on a pole that allowed folks who couldn't see over high habitats to use the mirror to look around in that space instead. Not something I anticipated before I worked with patrons who had this particular use case. And then last, but very important, is be honest. Don't promise things that you haven't secured yet, like access providers. And be upfront if if you have stairs somewhere that people are not going to be able to avoid and things like that, so that they can plan their day. All right, next slide. This one's a quick one. Do you need help setting up accommodations or accessing tools for captioning, audio description, assistive listening, and similar? We've got stuff for that at the equipment loan page on the Cultural Access Collaborative website. So I've left a link for that on this slide, and I believe it's also in our resources. Next slide, please. Okay, you've got folks on site. You've talked with them about accommodations. They've checked out your website. What now? A couple things that you might think about that are super easy to implement. Make sure your signage is accessible. So you'll want to make sure, just like your website, that your signs are legible and high contrast so that they're easy to read for lots of folks. If you can, it's also great to provide electronic versions of signage and other printed items like maps or playbills so that folks who are using a screen reader can interact with those versions in a way that works for them, or folks with, low vision can use things like pinch to zoom, etc. In the same vein, large print versions of items are fabulous to provide, especially, again, things like maps and playbills. If you can have even just a couple large print versions on hand to lend out to people, that can be really beneficial. One other note that I got from Bill is a lot of signage now includes QR codes that you have to scan with your phone. You can imagine that is potentially challenging if you are predominantly using your phone for voice stuff. So if you add tactile components to your QR codes, like just little raised dots that can indicate where someone should scan to use that QR code, that can be really helpful so that folks can get to your website or get whatever information those are meant to link them to. And the great thing is a lot of these are super easy to do, like right now. Adding raised dots to signage, providing larger print versions of things you've already created are usually low cost, very budget and time friendly options. All right, next slide, please. A couple notes on virtual programs. The Cultural Access Collaborative has a whole bunch of stuff on virtual programming. So I'll just talk very briefly here, because if you want to take a deeper dive, check out some of our past webinars. But a couple things, as Josh mentioned as well, we describe presenters and visual content in all of our programs, and that's something that you can do as well. You also may want to consider your language and whether it's meeting the needs of your audience or meeting just the general population's needs. So plain language is a great phrase you can look up to get some tips on how to make sure that the language that you're using is inclusive and is, meeting the needs of lots of different folks. You also in virtual programs may want to consider, I'm going to say should consider, providing communications accommodations like captioning, ASL, and audio description. And ideally, you'll provide slides and resources to folks ahead of time, but certainly after programming. All right, next slide. The last thing I want to say is, all right, your guests hopefully had a great experience, your patrons, the organization you were working with, et cetera. But you want to make sure that you know that. And so a lot of cultural spaces do surveys, do follow-ups, get feedback from folks. And you want to make sure that, just like everybody else, your disabled patrons are included in that. So a couple things you can do to support that. One, train evaluation staff and volunteers on access basics. So a lot of folks or a lot of places use volunteers to get, survey feedback from programming. If you can make sure that all those volunteers have a basic foundation on accessibility, that is really pivotal, both for, getting feedback from everybody that's visiting your space and making sure those volunteers feel confident. You also want to follow up specifically if you've arranged accommodations to make sure they're working as expected. So if you can, if you're working with somebody, reach out to them via email after the fact and make sure that everything panned out all right. And then last but not least, you should always be considering disabled folks when you're getting community feedback, when you're getting evaluations, when you're getting surveys. So make sure that you are, think through your design process for community feedback, for instance. And is it in a space that's only accessible to folks without mobility disabilities? Or is it in a virtual space that's, that's not accessible to everybody? When you send out evaluations, are you using those website best practices, like providing alt text, so that, everybody is able to respond? This will also get you just like better, cleaner, more high quality survey data. All right, I'll wrap things up and turn it back over to Bill for the next slide.
Thank you, Karen. The next section we'll talk about is our social and policy environment. Next slide, please. All right. Social and policy environment is going to include some of those policies that our organizations have and social expectations that are both written and unwritten, or the said and unsaid things about an environment. One thing I want to start with is person first language. Person first language puts the person before the disability. And I'm going to have some examples in the future. So I'll show, or the next slide. So I'll show what that means in a second. But I also just want to mention here that person first language, the implementation can be a good place to start, even with the internal culture of your organization and some of the conversations that might have. So it's a added benefit in what internally you might get, not just the external benefits from that also. Next bullet point is individual preferences should be respected. Identity first language. So if someone chooses not to use person first language, but they're identifying themselves as, for example, a blind person or a blind man or blind woman, you should never correct them. And other staff should be known that it's never our place to correct. Allow people to identify as they choose, use judgment, and know that there is nuance in that. Avoid euphemisms. Some of those euphemisms like special needs or even some other things. It's not necessary. I think using the word disability, disabled, is more clear and doesn't muddy your intentions. Avoid outdated language. I think a good example of that is, for example, recently I've seen a lot of people talking about using the term non-speaking over non-verbal. I would say that was in the maybe 6 months ago, there was a real push for that. So keeping up with what is the from the communities that identify as disabled, what is the language that they're using and what they're wanting other people to use. And again, be aware of those nuances. And the best way to do that is be educated about what people want. Let's go to our next slide. Thanks. I'm just going to share some examples of what person first language is. So I mentioned that it's putting that person before, so it would be saying a person who is blind or has low vision. So I'm going to show some examples of some of the languages that we would not use and some of the language that we would use. So I'll turn to that. So don't use terms like defect, cripple, handicap, especially when it comes to like handicap parking, afflicted, suffering, except use phrases like the specific disability. Rather than using a general term, say deaf, blind. Not just using these other general terms. Don't use handicapped, disabled, invalid, special, challenge, and I should say, clarify that's disabled on its own. But use that person first language. So person with a disability. Don't refer to it as you would not refer to something as like the blind as a group of people. Don't use confined or bound to wheelchair in a wheelchair. A person uses a wheelchair is a more accepted term to have us use. Again, don't use a phrase like the blind or visually impaired. Person who is blind or has low vision. I think that's a good example of a lot of people who are blind or low vision may use a term visually impaired. And again, don't correct them. Let them identify as they want, but I would not default that as the first language I would use. Next slide, please. Don't use terms like the deaf, hearing impaired, person who is deaf or hard of hearing, and that's with a capital D there. There are folks in the deaf community who will identify as deaf with capital D and those who do not. And then again, it falls into the preference. So don't use terms like insane, ill, crazy, lunatic, neurotic, maniac, psycho. Please use terms like person with psychiatric or mental disability. Don't use terms like feeble-minded, imbecile, mentally defective. Please use terms like person with a cognitive disability. No, we no longer use handicapped parking or restroom, but accessible parking or accessible restroom. I feel like that's a common one that I see. Next slides, please. So To continue with our social and policy environment, one of those places where a lot of these policies come into play is in hiring practices. One of the common things we think of is no undue burden in job requirements. For instance, putting in a job requirement, unnecessary weight, that saying that this job needs to be able to lift 50 pounds of weight when that's not a requirement, or stand for long periods of time when it can be done without staying for long periods of time. Even those educational requirements, like holding a bachelor or master's degree as part of this. A work from home policy can be a great way to think about accessibility in a job. Um, and um, anyways, letting people have the chance to work from home. Dress codes can also be a great way of thinking about how we can be more accommodating to folks and create jobs that are actually inclusive by analyzing our dress code. Is it necessary? And then how are employees, both when they're onboarding and while they have been with the organization for a while, what is their process for accommodating requests? I would add one more thing to this about hiring is it's a great practice to know when employees, especially our hourly employees or part-time staff, if they receive any benefits like disability, social security, and working a certain number of hours would jeopardize any of those benefits. It'd be great to track that and to ensure that those benefits will not be affected by that person working at your organization. Security is another one. Oftentimes, people come in contact with security when it's only for a negative reason. Or there might also be cases like security checks. Is your security trained on in the security check if someone feels uncomfortable with whether it might be actually a pat down or other close contact? Thinking about are they are security trained to recognize how people might react related to a disability? What is your policy when you're calling security? Is it always the default that people will call security if someone is acting in a way that they do not feel is typical? Does staff have both the freedom to not call security and the understanding of the nuance of how someone might act in a way that is not typical to our how we typically see guests, but is just as a representation of a disability? And then finally, in this, the audience expectations. This is a great one of those unwritten rules. What behaviors are expected from an audience member at your venue? Are they expected to be quiet, to move through areas in very gentle ways? Possibly guests are not who identify as disabled will not always be presenting in that way. I especially think of a nonverbal guest who may use a lot of variation in the way that they express themselves and might not be typical in those spaces that are typically seen as quiet. Can we move to our next slide, please? All right. And to leave you with this section and a great action that I think was come up before, something that you can do today. And on the slide, there's the phrase from the disability community, nothing about us without us. Anytime you are thinking about implementing these changes or working in any of the things that we've mentioned today, we strongly recommend, and a place to start is working with people from the disability community, whether this is in focus groups, offering free tickets, and then collecting feedback from people. There's a lot of ways to actually ask people to give their feedback and to use their lived experience. And I highly recommend, when possible, to pay people for their time and their expertise in these areas. Go to the next slide and I'll pass it off.
QR code center left.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carly Englander. I'm one of the steering committee members. I am a white woman and use she, her pronouns. I was one of the creators of the resource document that you will be receiving today. You can check out the QR code or the link that will be dropping into the chat. You will be able to access today's slideshow presentations and the handouts and resources that we tailor-made for today's program. We feel access is a journey, and for that reason, we wanted to share some resources, useful resources that can help you along at whatever stage you happen to be on that journey. In the spirit of simplicity, we've worked to mirror the presentation that you've seen today. So with that being said, you can view various videos, blog posts, and PDFs in the categories of physical environments, communications environments, information environments, and social and policy environments. And I hope you enjoy and find the information informative and enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, we are going to do the Q&A. This is Josh speaking. So to begin, one question that came in when Karen was speaking was this: is it possible to create a large print version of my documents in-house, or do I need to head somewhere to get that printed?
Hey, this is Karen. I can jump in and help answer that. It essentially depends on your resources. So if you have, sorry, I'm thinking out loud. It depends on what you're trying to create and your resources. Let's say that you have, let's use a playbill as an example. That's often like a half-page sized booklet. So you can make it twice as big by just printing it on 8.5 by 11 pages, or even just expanding the pictures and font sizes and creating, a stapled together packet of the same materials. But you can also totally work with a copy shop to get like larger print maps and things like that created if you feel like that's the best option. In general, making that decision is a matter of just asking the patrons who are going to be using those resources. So before you go out and print 50 3-foot wide maps of your space, ask somebody if that's actually helpful or if they'll just feel like they're carting around a beach towel all day.
Excellent. So everyone, this is Josh again. Feel free to continue submitting questions if you have any. We are happy to answer those. Moving on to the next question, and again, this will be for any of the presenters. What are some strategies and tips for centering accessibility and implementing services or practices at a nonprofit with limited resources? This is Josh. I will start while the others are seeing if they want to jump in. Some ideas that have been brought to my attention would be for those with limited resources, doing as much in-house as possible, and that can be some version of some type of captioning if you have ongoing programming to be able to do some of that internally. Any of the recorded work, getting that captioned internally as well. Also, if you are really working within a community and you know others, bartering is also something. I've seen companies work with individuals where individuals want to go. So the interpreters or the captioners want to go. Let's say it's a show, and so they're given season tickets in lieu of doing the, or in kind for doing the interpreting or the captioning. So there's versions of that, of if it's a library, they're given meeting room space in as far as is that some type of a bartering type environment. And I also think that there's certain people who do want to support in ways, and I think that there's grants and resources out there and available for you. So those are just a few quick things. Also utilizing the resources that we have available in our equipment loan program. If you don't know what we have available, it's all listed on the website. So those are key things that have just come to mind for me, but I open the floor to others. I see Karen.
Hey, this is Karen. One other thing that I wanted to mention, because it's worked really well for me, is finding some of those best practices you want to implement and just being consistent about modeling them. It's free to always audio describe yourself when you start a program, or to add alt text to your images. Not to mention, it just makes your stuff better and your SEO work more seamlessly. And those are things that then people will often just pick up on. I remember being really proud at some point when, I don't know, a year after I had been working with a bunch of folks in a previous department on like tactile models and the use of them in programming, one of my coworkers like called me out on something and was like, hey, wait a minute, couldn't this be more accessible by like folding this aspect in? And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Hooray. So if you just model those best practices, it's free, and you'll often find that more people get, they come into the fold, and then they want to know how to create better accessibility too.
Hi, this is Bill. Yeah, I'm a big believer in that accessibility does not have to be an expensive thing, and we've shown, I think, some range of examples today that were more and less expensive. But I would also add to it in your hiring practices when you're already filling those positions for front of house or facilitators, guest facing, or even other staff, being very intentional about hiring folks with disabilities and providing a way for them to give feedback about the organization where it can be more accessible, both for staff and guests, and then also those guests that are front facing. When your folks with disability, or excuse me, those staff that are front facing, when those guests with this who identify as disabled are coming, they will have someone who they see or they have some identity with, and that will also go a long way in your venue becoming a more inclusive and welcoming spot.
This is Josh. The Kennedy Center also has a great tip sheet for creating in-house large print programs. That link is listed by Hillary in the chat. For doing your own captions, also Tina has a web link in our resources that will give you some additional ways of doing your own. Thanks, Tina, for that. Any others while we have you here on any of the topics covered today?
This is Karen. I just want to mention there was a question in the chat about contrast and like color checking for accessibility, and Hillary called it out before I even got to link it, but there's a great one from WebAIM that's linked in the chat, or WebAIM, that I love because it has large and small font as well as graphics. So it gives you some clues on like what the contrast needs to be for these different things.
This is Josh. Thank you, Karen. Another question that came in is understanding access in a building that's not accessible. What could you share on that? And how do we make heritage spaces accessible?
This is Bill, and I would. This is a great question. This is like a series you could do on its own. So, um, I would just say for one thing, what spaces, when you're thinking about accessible, is it that they're not accessible because of uh, maybe a wheelchair would not be able to travel through because a doorway is old and it's not doesn't meet a requirement for a wheelchair to pass through, or other things like that. Um, that where that is limited, think about concentrating things in areas that are then accessible to a wheelchair. But with heritage sites and things like that too, there can be a tremendous lot of accessibility in it when it comes to like tactile things. So think about what can be touched, what could even be touched with gloves on and things like that for our guests who are blind or have low vision. And always with the heritage site, um, being able to have a person there to do that cultural interpretation and tell stories in and of itself can be a great way to provide a really meaningful experience to any guest. So, especially a guest with a disability is looking for a meaningful experience that staff in the way they do cultural interpretation might be providing a lot. So, I would say don't concentrate on like thinking that the way somebody visit has to be one thing, that there has to be one way to interact with that site, one prescribed way to tour that site, but think of all the variations in the way that someone can experience and tour that site, and all the meaningful experiences that are available outside of that kind of like typical way, and doing that. I hope that makes sense. But
This is Josh. One other recommendation that came in was spaces that are unable to be modified in some way to provide access, then taking that and making some remote option available for folks who cannot actually be on site. And so really kind of thinking outside of the box and being more creative on ways you can bring people in, but doing it in a remote capacity for individuals to still be able to access that in some capacity, even though it may not be actually on site.
This is Karen. I just wanted to jump in and hard agree on Bill's mention of cultural interpreters as a great resource in heritage sites, especially because that's often where heritage sites are focusing a lot of their educational programming already. And the more that you can train those interpreters in the foundations of accessibility, the better they will be able to meet the needs of all of your learners. I can't tell you how many like cool wins I have had over the years from working with volunteers in interpretive programming who by like training them in foundations and then more detailed, more nuanced accessibility aspects, and then having them come back and be like, hey, I had this really cool moment where I was able to connect a guest to this, to this space, to this exhibit, to this animal, in a new and different way, and then, showcase that to the rest of the volunteers. It just it's a snowball going downhill where the more you can create that foundation, the better everything will work.
This is Josh. Thank you. And in the chat, just drawing attention to our equipment loan program. There's a link in there for that to tell you all of the equipment that is available to you there. Tina has also submitted something in the chat that something came in this morning via email from the U.S. Department of Justice. It's Small Entity Compliance Guide. There's a link for that listed there. Any other questions? These are great questions so far. Thank you. All right. At this point, we will proceed. If you do happen to have any further questions, feel free to still include those. We will still answer those as we can. And then from here, we will proceed with a bit more information.
Apologies, that's me having trouble coming back on camera. Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for this session. Oh, we have one more question. Should we jump to that since we have a second before I wrap things up?
Absolutely. This is Josh. The question is it okay to ask if guests need accommodations on the ticket form?
This is Bill, if I can take this. I would say absolutely ask for accommodations on ticket forms. I think it's always a good practice to have an open field rather than just having a like, here are some drop down options of what you can choose from, because you for sure will miss something if you're providing a limited number of options, and somebody might put in a request that is easily there's a very reasonable request for you to complete, but it was not something that was thought of in the drop down boxes. So that's best practices. And I would also, though, add in whether it's an email or phone numbers or other contact for additional access information when needed.
And this is Josh, just ensuring that if you do list that on a form, that you are actually going to be able to provide it or are willing to provide it as well.
Very true.
Sometimes you enter, this is Karen, sometimes this kicks you into a dialogue with a person. That's also, that open field is also, wherever you list that is a great place to link what you have available just de facto, so folks can know, oh, I don't even need to get an accommodation. Great last question. And with that, I think we will wrap things up because there's just a few minutes left in our session today. So our next slide has a couple QR codes on the screen. And also, I believe you should be able to find, yes, there's links in the chat as well, for two things that are both extremely helpful for us. Just like we mentioned, it's always good to survey folks after a program and make sure that it was accomplishing what you hoped. So if you would like to take our survey, we would very much appreciate that.
Left QR code for survey.
We also have a request for donations link available.
Right QR code.
Both in the chat and as a QR code here. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a small donation to support our work. Even just $5 helps make our work sustainable in the future. And we are, we're always continually striving to offer relevant, useful, and accessible programming. So we value your support and your feedback. Next slide, please. I just want to thank our presenters again. Thanks, Josh and Bill, and all of our, we have a bunch of Cultural Access Collab folks supporting this programming as well, like Carly and Ruben and Tina and more people if I scroll down my web links, as well as our service providers. Thank you so much for providing captioning, for providing interpretation. Thank you all for joining us and offering your support to the Cultural Access Collaborative. We will wrap things up here, but we are, always thrilled to hear from you. So if you have follow-up questions after this session, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, this session has concluded. Please exit the webinar, and thank you so much for supporting the Cultural Access Collaborative.
Credits appear. Creating Accessible Cultural Spaces, presented by Cultural Access Collaborative. For workshop resources and more information, visit culturalaccesscollab.org. Presenting speakers: Bill Green, Hart Prins Fund Accessibility and Inclusion Manager at Lincoln Park Zoo. Josh Garrett, General Manager of Operations at AI Media. Karen Tekverk, Manager of the SERP program at the Society for Ecological Restoration. Workshop Accessibility, Efficiency Reporting, Real-Time Captioning. Faith Interpreting Services, ASL Interpretation. Video Editing, Captioning, and Audio Description by BridgetMelton.com.